There was once a time when, because of farting, Earth literally caught fire and burned for 60,000 years straight. Not just forest fires or volcanic eruptions, the entire planet was basically one giant ball of fire that refused to go out. This actually happened 56 million years ago, and it was so intense that crocodiles were living at the North Pole, palm trees were growing in Alaska, and the oceans got so hot that most marine life just died. By the end of this video, you're going to learn about the most extreme climate disaster in Earth's history. We're talking about temperatures that would kill you in minutes, oceans that turned into acid baths, and animals that had to completely change their body size just to survive. And the scariest part? Some scientists think it could happen again. But first, let me tell you how this whole nightmare started, because it began with something that sounds almost innocent. The fart that nearly ended the world. 56 million years ago, Earth was already pretty warm. There were no ice caps, and even the poles were tropical. But then something insane happened that made our current climate change look like a gentle spring breeze. It started on the ocean floor. Massive deposits of methane hydrates, basically frozen farts from ancient sea creatures, had been sitting there for millions of years. These things are like climate time bombs, and when they get warm enough, they explode into the atmosphere as methane gas. And methane is nasty stuff. It traps heat 25 times more effectively than carbon dioxide. So when these deposits started melting, it was like someone opened the gates of hell and let all the heat demons loose at once. As the methane hit the atmosphere and started warming things up, it caused even more methane deposits to melt. Then those released more methane, which caused more warming, which melted more deposits. It was like a climate domino effect that nobody could stop. Within just a few thousand years, which is basically instant in geological terms, global temperatures shot up by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but when you're talking about the entire planet, that's the difference between a normal world and a literal hellscape. And once this process started, there was no stopping it. The world was about to burn for the next 60,000 years. When crocodiles ruled the Arctic, the warming happened so fast that life on Earth had no time to adapt gradually. Animals either evolved quickly or they died, and the ones that survived had to make some pretty extreme changes. Take crocodiles, for example. Today, these guys can barely survive a mild winter, but during this burning period called the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, or PETM, crocodiles were living in the Arctic Circle. We've found their fossils in places that are now frozen tundra. But these weren't just regular crocodiles that somehow learned to like the cold. These were monster crocodiles. Some of them grew to over 40 feet long, bigger than most dinosaurs. When your planet turns into an oven, apparently the solution is to become a giant killing machine. And it wasn't just crocodiles, snakes got huge too. We've found fossils of snakes from this period that were over 40 feet long and thick as tree trunks. The Titanoboa, which lived right after the PETM, gives us an idea of what these heat-loving serpents looked like. They were basically living garden hoses of death. But the really weird part was what happened to mammals. Most of them got smaller. A lot smaller. Horses went from the size of large dogs to the size of house cats. It's called the Lilliput effect, and it happens when animals shrink to deal with extreme heat and limited resources. Your ancestors, the early primates, were about the size of squirrels during this time. They had to stay small to avoid overheating in a world where temperatures regularly hit 35 degrees Celsius or 95 degrees Fahrenheit in places that are now frozen wastelands. The oceans turned into acid. While the land was busy turning into a giant barbecue, the oceans were having their own nightmare. All that extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere wasn't just warming things up, it was dissolving into the seawater and turning it acidic. Ocean acidification is bad news for anything with a shell or skeleton made of calcium carbonate, and back then, that was pretty much everything living in the sea. Tiny organisms called foraminifera, which form the base of the ocean food chain, started dissolving alive. The ocean temperature at the equator reached 35 degrees Celsius, that's 95 degrees Fahrenheit. For comparison, most tropical fish today start dying when water hits 30 degrees Celsius. The PETM oceans were literally too hot for most marine life to survive, but some creatures found a way to adapt. Deep sea organisms moved to even deeper, cooler waters. Some fish developed better heat tolerance. And a few species of plankton actually thrived in the new conditions, creating massive algae blooms that turned parts of the ocean green. The really crazy part, we can still see evidence of this ocean disaster today. There's a layer of sediment from this time period that's completely different from everything above and below it. It's like a geological scar that shows exactly when the oceans went haywire. And speaking of scars, the land wasn't doing much better. When forests became furnaces. The extreme heat didn't just make animals uncomfortable, it literally changed the landscape. Forests that had existed for millions of years suddenly burst into flames and never grew back. Entire ecosystems vanished in what might have been the largest wildfire event in Earth's history. But nature is weird, and some plants actually loved the new conditions. Tropical plants spread to places they'd never been before. Palm trees started growing in Wyoming. Mangrove swamps appeared in places that are now deserts. The plant life got so lush in some areas that when it died and got buried, it formed massive coal deposits. Some of the coal we burn today actually comes from plants that grew during this 60,000-year heat wave. We're literally burning the remains of the world's worst climate disaster to power our modern world. And the changes weren't just happening on the surface. The extreme heat caused massive changes in weather patterns. Monsoons became more intense, droughts lasted longer, and hurricanes probably got so powerful that they would make modern Category 5 storms look like gentle breezes. But the most terrifying part wasn't how hot it got, it was how long it lasted. The heat that wouldn't stop. Most climate disasters are relatively quick. Volcanic eruptions might cause a few years of cooling. Asteroid impacts might cause a decade of winter. But the PETM was different. It just kept going and going and going. For 60,000 years, Earth was stuck in this overheated state. That's longer than all of recorded human history. Imagine if the climate disaster that started when your great-great-great-grandparents were born was still going on today, and wouldn't end until your great-great-great-grandchildren were dead. The reason it lasted so long was because of feedback loops. As the planet got hotter, it released more greenhouse gases, which made it even hotter, which released even more gases. It was like a climate engine that fed on itself and couldn't be turned off. Ice caps that had existed for millions of years completely disappeared. Sea levels rose by over 200 feet. Coastlines that had been stable since the dinosaurs suddenly found themselves underwater. And through it all, life had to keep adapting. Generation after generation of animals and plants had to deal with a world that was fundamentally broken. Some species went extinct. Others evolved so rapidly that they became completely different creatures. But eventually, something had to give. How? The fire finally went out. After 60,000 years of non-stop burning, Earth finally found a way to cool down. But it wasn't because the greenhouse gases magically disappeared, it was because life itself fought back. Plants and algae started pulling massive amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Ocean organisms began building shells again, locking carbon away in limestone. And weathering of rocks, which happens faster in hot, wet conditions, started removing CO2 from the air. It was like the planet's immune system finally kicked in and started fighting off the fever, but it took another 100,000 years for temperatures to return to normal. That's a total of 160,000 years of climate chaos. When it was all over, Earth looked completely different. New species had evolved. Old ecosystems had vanished. The geography had changed. It was basically a different planet. But the most important change was in the atmosphere itself. The PETM had pumped so much carbon into the air that it fundamentally altered how Earth's climate system worked. Some scientists think we're still feeling the effects today. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that sounds bad, but it happened 56 million years ago. What does this have to do with me? The amount of carbon that caused the PETM was about 3,000 billion tons. Humans have already released about 1,500 billion tons of carbon since the Industrial Revolution. We're halfway to recreating the worst climate disaster in Earth's history. And we're doing it much faster than the PETM happened. The original event took thousands of years to get going. We've done half the damage in just 200 years. But wait, there's more bad news. Remember those methane deposits I mentioned at the beginning? The ones that started the whole PETM disaster? They're still there. And they're starting to melt again. In the Arctic Ocean, scientists are finding massive methane plumes bubbling up from the seafloor. Permafrost that's been frozen for thousands of years is melting and releasing methane. We might be triggering the same feedback loops that caused the PETM. The difference is, this time there are 8 billion humans on the planet who need food, water, and stable weather to survive. The animals that saw it all. Some creatures actually made it through the entire PETM and lived to tell the tale. Well, not literally tell the tale, but you know what I mean. Sharks, for example, barely noticed the climate chaos. They just kept swimming around, eating things, and being sharks. Some species of turtles also made it through without much trouble. And deep-sea creatures in the coldest parts of the ocean just waited it out. The real winners were the mammals. After the PETM ended, they exploded in diversity. The extreme conditions had forced them to evolve rapidly, and when things cooled down, they were ready to take over the world. Early horses, which had shrunk to cat size during the heat, grew back to normal size and spread across the globe. Primates, including our ancestors, diversified into dozens of new species. And entirely new groups of mammals appeared that had never existed before. In a weird way, the PETM might have been necessary for mammal evolution. Without that 60,000-year pressure cooker, we might never have evolved at all. The lesson from hell. The PETM teaches us that Earth's climate system has a breaking point. Push it too far, and it doesn't just get a little warmer. It goes completely haywire for tens of thousands of years. It also shows us that life is incredibly resilient, but not in the way you might think. Individual species die out all the time during climate disasters. But life as a whole finds a way to survive and even thrive in the new conditions. The question is, do we want to find out how resilient human civilization is? Because if we keep pumping carbon into the atmosphere at current rates, we might get to experience our own version of the PETM. Except this time, instead of crocodiles in the Arctic, we'll have billions of climate refugees, failed crops, and cities underwater. The world burned for 60,000 years once before, and if we're not careful, it might just decide to do it again.